the Ukrainian army, can they defeat Russia if they get the right amount of training, the right inputs? If we get all the stuff right, do they have the capacity to actually defeat Russia, drive them out of their land, and reestablish the 1991 borders? We know that it hasn't happened so far. We know they haven't been able to do that up to this point. But is the problem equipment, and is it training? Or is it just a bridge too far and it's not going to matter? We're going to have somebody on today that can help us unpack this along with the commander of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. General Syrskyi is also going to join us via tape on CNN and is going to provide some surprising answers that, well, maybe not quite what he thought, but Larry is going to help us unpack what they really mean. Larry, welcome back to the show.
Good to be with you, sir.
Always great to have you on here because you're number one. Not are you just a straight shooter, but you're also a really good analyst. And in fact, the timing couldn't be better to have you on this topic today because you've just published something on your own sonar21.com on your site there called "Why the Lack of Training is Ukraine's Achilles Heel." So that's obviously going to play in a lot to what we're talking about here. And if anybody's been watching our show, of course, knows that the answer to my rhetorical question at the open, there is no path to victory for the Ukraine. It's not going to matter. But lots in the West keep saying that it is and that it's going to. And if we just get them a little bit more stuff and a little bit more time, that everything's going to change. And I want you to help us understand why that's just frankly not the case. And I want to start off, actually, no, I want to start off with your article there, even before we get into these comments from Syrskyi. What was the motive behind your writing that article, and what's the general gist of the conclusion you draw?
Well, I was sitting around listening to, a lot of different analysts and people talk about the progress of the war and realized, they didn't have any hands-on experience with the whole training environment that is the U.S. military, though not just U.S., that is any military. And I was fortunate during my time at State. My mentor, my boss, was a retired Marine colonel, and he schooled me pretty well. And then also when I subsequently was doing consulting work with JSOC, I worked under another retired Army colonel who had actually written JOPES. So,
I'm sorry, could you tell us what JSOC and JOPES are?
Yeah, so JSOC stands for Joint Special Operations Command. It's the special forces. They oversee a whole variety of, top secret units, and then they work with Special Operations Command. And then JOPES stands for Joint Organization Planning. I forget what the E and the S is, but it's the overall organization of how the military is going to respond if there is a terrorist incident or if they're preparing to go to war. So either a critical incident response or something that's more you got time to prepare for. But anyway, it's a very elaborate planning process. And what I learned over the years was my part was to recreate the environment of what State Department would be communicating, either during a real world crisis or events, so that the military would get that information and they'd be able to react. But what I was a witness to was these were extensive preparations for training, and that if the Army, if the Navy, if the Marine Corps, if the Air Force, if they're not fighting, they're training. And so the training is what the military does. But to carry out those training missions, there's got to be preparation, there's got to be resources, there have to be personnel, and you have to have a safe environment to do it. And one of the things that's become so apparent in Ukraine is that because of the reach of Russian missiles and drones, there's no safe space. There's no place that you can go set up a group to train. And so that
was more graphically depicted last week when you had in Poltava, when you had that training place there that was smacked because they did get a bunch of people together and they paid for it.
Yeah. And in fact, the Russians have hit since then, I think, 5 other sites that were very similar with maybe not as many. I know Doug McGregor's reporting upwards of 720 were killed there. But, that was what was in the back of my mind. You can't bring them together. And then even if you take him outside of Ukraine, you create other problems with lack of standardization, which we've talked about before. And then lo and behold, General Syrskyi pops up in this interview with Christian Amanpour of CNN, and he confirms what I was saying. I was like, hey, thanks, General Syrskyi. But he admitted they're only giving these guys 2 to 4 weeks of training, if that.
Yeah. And actually, that's a good segue, because here in a minute we actually have that segment of it that's in there. But then there's some other stuff too, and I want to start with a different one, because it's going to kind of roll into how these things all fit together or don't, as the case may be. Now, one of the first ones we're going to have here is that Christiane Amanpour is one of the better reporters, in my view, in the West, because she at least asks some of the hard questions. She didn't ask some of the good follow-up, and part of that's because she's not a military expert and doesn't know what to ask, but she does have a really good analytical mind, and she asks some good hard questions like this one.
Can I ask you about the obvious imbalance, and that is essentially Ukraine, while you're fighting hard, you are outgunned by the Russians. They have much more air superiority, for instance, more drones, they have more missile capability, they have more artillery capability. How do you assess the difference between what you have and what they have? And how do you make up for that difference?
You
are absolutely right, because the enemy does have an advantage in aviation, in missiles, in artillery, in the amount of ammunition they use, of course, in personnel, tanks and infantry fighting vehicles. But this also motivates us. We cannot fight in the same way as they do, so we must use, first of all, the most effective approach, use our forces and means with maximum use of terrain features, engineering structures, and also to use technical superiority.
Okay, we're going to get into that technical superiority here in just a second, or his claim is. But what do you make of his original claim that, first of all, that Russia's massive superiority in all those categories that Christiane Amanpour mentioned so accurately motivates us?
The only thing missing there was Frank Sinatra. I think it was Frank Sinatra who sang the song, "We've got high hopes. We've got high hopes." That's all they got. And their high hopes they're narcotic based. I mean, let's be frank about that. It's either Syrskyi in that interview looks like he'd had a hit or two of the vodka bottle, and Commandante Zelensky is a noted fan of the Colombian product that the Colombians are so good at producing. I mean, Christiane had it; she nailed it. They have nothing. The only other thing she could have brought out was to say, "Hey, we don't have the troops. Hey, they're good. Gary just pulled up the high hopes."
Yeah, yeah, that might have been better than the interview we just saw there. It's more realistic. Yeah. But what about the second part there? He said, but what we can do is we can make maximum use of terrain masking and tactics on the ground, et cetera. That can basically. Because their specific question was, how do you overcome those deficiencies? And he says, well, it motivates us, and we'll use tactics, we'll use terrain features, we'll use defensive works, etc. That's how we're going to overcome it. Explain that to me.
Well, that comes back to our original, where we started. You got to have trained personnel to do that. You have to have trained personnel who understand the difference between cover and concealment. You have to have people that understand how to have light discipline, noise discipline, communications discipline, when they can and cannot use the cell phone, when they can and cannot use electronic communications. I mean, because the Russians have a superior electronic warfare capability, and they're constantly sweeping to see if they got any hotspots out there. And when they find a hotspot, lo and behold, they can actually hit it with pretty quick with a rocket. So again, Syrskyi is he's talking about high hopes that are not grounded in any kind of reality. Because the fact of the matter is, the Donbass is the heart of Russia. So I saw a poster. I think it was made in like 1927, but it was in the then Soviet Union, and they showed the Donbass, and the Russian expression is I think it was Donetsk Serce Rossiya, Donetsk, the heart of Russia. And it showed all of these different minerals, agricultural, industrial. I mean, it's literally a powerhouse that was part of Russia and
And
was
by the
seen
way,
as
there's a whole stream that runs all across the north of the entire country of gas and oil departments, especially natural gas.
yeah. Yeah, I mean it's been that way for years. And that was why it was always part of Russia. It was not part of Ukraine until, Khrushchev made the decision to gift his the land he was born in.
It's
That
interesting. Not a lot of people realize, but the Donbass area itself was a major scene of a lot of World War II fighting. So
Yeah.
Russians also have a lot of memories, pro and con, of when they got hammered and when they also won huge victories. So it's really important emotionally, I think, to the Russians, more so than people recognize.
Well, right, and that's why the Nazis wanted it. I mean, it had all of these coal reserves. It had gas. It had oil. It was not some agricultural wasteland by any stretch, and that's what we're seeing. One of the things that did slow up the Russians early on in their advance to this region was you had these Ukrainians entrenched in these massive underground structures, coal mines, salt mines. So they had lots of underground protection that they had to be rooted out. But now that's really accelerated for the Russian side, and the Ukrainians are falling back. And Syrskyi, he doesn't have an answer for it because no matter what tactics they want to employ, they don't have the trained personnel to carry out those tactics.
And then after saying, at least claiming, that they're going to have terrain masking and all that other kind of stuff, then he says, but actually the other big thing that we can do is technological. We can technologically move beyond and neutralize the Russian stuff. Watch this.
You know that we have created the world's first such kind of troops as the Unmanned Systems Forces. We have created a command, we have created units, we have created regiments, we have created battalions, which are now proving their effectiveness in various parts of the front line. Our best unmanned systems units are concentrated in the Pokrovsk sector. In addition, of course, we use maneuvers with force, reserves, and fire. Thanks to the actions of our government, the President of Ukraine, the Minister of Defense, we managed to reduce the difference between the ammunition used by us and the enemy. The proportion is actually 1 to 2, 1 to 2.5. A year ago, this figure was 1 to 10, 1 to 6. We are trying to maximize our technical superiority over the enemy to offset their superiority in terms of numbers.
Isn't it odd, Larry, that he wants to use this as example, Pokrovsk area? So earlier in that same interview, he said that there hadn't been any advances in the Russian. They had it contained, and for 6 days there hadn't been any advances, which is just categorically a lie. I mean, it's just graphically depicted to where you can see on the map. I showed that earlier this afternoon, actually, or as recently as overnight. But then he also claims that they had a disadvantage in one of the tech categories of 1 to 10, and now it's only 1 to 2. So one would think, okay, if it's 5 times better in your favor, then things should be getting better for you. But instead, as you just pointed out, things are actually accelerating in the opposite direction. So how do you reconcile those two things?
Well, you don't. I mean, you have to look at the hard, cold numbers. What's happening on the casualty front? Are the casualties diminishing or increasing? Well, the credible numbers for the Russians show that on the Russian side, the casualties have been diminishing, not increasing, in spite of more aggressive offensive actions by the Russians. One of the explanations for that is, one, they're going up against untrained troops. 2, untrained troops who are not well armed and are not in a position to deliver many lethal blows. And 3, those troops are retreating rapidly across the front. And despite the retreat, the casualty figures for the Ukrainians have gone from, on average, a year ago, 700 a month to now 2,300. 2,300 a day. I said a month. It was 700 a day a year ago, 2,300 a day now. I mean, those are horrific losses. And Ukraine is just not going to be able to sustain it. At some point, they're like they're going to run out of armor, they're going to run out of artillery, they're going to run out of people.
Yeah.
They've had pretty effective drone program. Yeah, I give them that. But the Russians' drone program is far bigger, far larger, and far more industrially based. Plus, the Russians are using drones produced by Iran as well. And Iran came up with its drones thanks to the CIA because they took down a CIA drone and then replicated it.
Nice. And we actually have seen at least one report a couple of weeks ago that the Ukrainian side had been succeeding at a rate in 2023 of about 40% of their drones were finding the target, and the other 60% were either shot down or eliminated by electronic warfare. And at least allegedly, according to one report, I don't know how accurate it is, I can't say, but the claim is that now it's down to about 10% effectiveness, and 90% are knocked out by various means, even though they have large numbers. And they're trying to offset it by more numbers. And we see these videos come across. So we know that even if it's only 10%, that's 10% of a large number. So it's not inconsequential, but it does show you it's moving in the opposite direction, not the better direction for the Ukraine side. Now, the next thing I want to shift to is something you mentioned at the top here, when he's going to be talking about the kind of training that they do and how much they actually give. And I want to preface this by saying, for the United States, when we're talking about just a leg infantryman, just a base U.S. soldier infantryman who requires less training than anything more technical, like a armored personnel carrier, a tank, or some of these other kind of high tech equipment, is 10 months of basic training and 10 weeks of basic training and 12 weeks of advanced individual training to be an infantryman, to be a private, to enter into a unit for the first time. That's 22 weeks. So about 5 months of training that we give to somebody to start to go into a unit that has people that experience in it. With that as an understanding, listen to this.
Speaking of the training, of course, everyone wants the level of training to be the best. So we train highly qualified professional military personnel. At the same time, the dynamics at the front require us to put conscripted servicemen into service as soon as possible. That is why we conduct a compulsory basic military training for at least a month, and qualified training, which is at least 2 weeks a month.
Okay, so first of all, by all reports I'm getting, they don't get a month at least. I think that's like the maximum they ideally hope for, but very few of them apparently get even 1 month, not 5, to be thrown into the base here. Now, he said the personnel are highly trained, highly qualified, motivated troops. Yeah, that's not quite matching with what we have video evidence of. And Gary, if you can just start playing some of these motivated troops that are being, corralled and forced into service. And Larry, if you could now talk, because this is, I know, the heart of what your article was about. What do you say when you hear him say those things?
Yeah, well, when you've got, by contrast, Russia, where 30,000 people plus a month are signing up to join. They're not being chased down the street. They're not being shoved into the back of a car. They're not being attacked with guys trying to meet a quota for the day. So that's point number one. But then you look at the ages. I think a version of 60 Minutes just came out in the last couple of days that showed them with a group of new recruits that were learning how to fire the automatic squad weapons on the Ukrainian side. The guys were 40 and 50 years old. Now, sorry, but there's things that 20-year-olds can do that 40 and 50-year-olds can't. Just the physical strains and abuse that they can take. So that shows you the state of what Ukraine is in when that is what they're using for, quote, training these personnel. Yeah, the older guys may be a little wiser, but they'll definitely be less willing to take risks. Guarantee that, because they've been around long enough to know that, hey, I can get seriously killed or hurt here. But Ukraine doesn't have an answer for that. And apart from that, they don't have a secure location where they can take new recruits and allow them to be trained for 5-6 months before they're put into combat. If they had that in place already, and we're feeding it into the system, it'd be one thing. Yeah, I would say, yeah, they could probably sustain this war, but they don't have that. And that's why these people who argue that, oh, this is a stalemate, oh, the Ukraine can stretch this out for years. No, they can't. They could if they had that training pipeline, but they don't have
Gary,
the training pipeline.
if you could bring that full screen up that we used earlier today, the CNN report about what the mobilized troops are doing, because that has direct relevance to what Larry's talking about here. And what you're going to see here in just a second, Larry, is that it's not just the technology, it's not just the insufficient number of troops, or even the fact that, like you said, that they don't get enough training for the people, and that they're I guess their manpower pool from which they draw is now just whatever they can grab, however old they are, et cetera. And, on top of all that stuff that you mentioned there's also the psychological fact of how willing do you think these people are going to be to fight? So this is from, I think earlier, no, it was yesterday. I'm sorry. It's outgunned and outnumbered Ukraine's military struggling with both low morale and desertion. This is so important. You talk about throwing this on top of the already difficult time. And what this article talks about is one of the, they interviewed some of the, actually, I think it said 5 different commanders, Ukrainian commanders, under condition of anonymity so they wouldn't get in trouble and put in jail by their people. One of them said, not all mobilized soldiers are leaving their positions, but the majority are. When new guys come here, they see how difficult it is. They see a lot of enemy drones, artillery, and mortars. One unit commander currently fighting till CNN. He also asked to remain anonymous. They go to positions once, and if they survive, they never return. They either leave their positions, refuse to go into battle, or try to find another way to leave the army. So you're talking about, Larry, the difficulty with even finding qualified people, the difficulty with getting them trained even minimally. And now then, when do you get these people who are rushed through training? And I think this is so important to what you're talking about here, that when those rushed through training people who are not qualified get there, that's how they perform. They run away, or they're looking for the first way to fight. You can't win a war that way.
No. And we've even seen from some of the Western mercenaries, particularly U.S. Former U.S. military personnel who fought and served in Iraq, fought and served in Afghanistan. So they thought, hey, I'm a hardened combat veteran. Now, I'm not in any way trying to disrespect or diminish the service of people who served in those capacities. But to a man, those that have gone into Ukraine and that have been on the front lines up against the Russians, with a full panoply of weaponry, from drones, from artillery, from fixed-wing aircraft, from these fab bombs. They're shell-shocked. They come away quickly saying, we've never experienced anything like that in terms of intensity, in terms of the physical oppression, the violence. Think back at it. None of the Afghan opposition had fixed-wing aircraft to drop bombs on us, and they certainly didn't have any major artillery pieces. They did have some mortars, and the same in Iraq. So, the United States, the truth of the matter is, has not ever fought in this kind of condition since Korea War, maybe partially Vietnam. They were up against some Vietnamese units that could fight like this, but not with the scale and intensity of what's being experienced in Ukraine. And no matter how much training, this is the other thing people forget, no matter how much training you give people for those circumstances, you don't erase their humanity, their soul. And different people react differently to that kind of stress. And a lot of people just can't handle it. And they crumble and they crash. Others, out of just a sense of survival, go, I got to get out of here. I can't. I'm not going to do this. So
Yeah. And
it's
you
just
see them admitting that in that CNN piece. Those are Ukrainians. It's not anybody being accused of being, from the West or anybody else, or the Russian side, for example. That's what they're saying about themselves. And I can validate what you said there. I have 4 combat deployments, one of which was a big tank-on-tank battle, Desert Storm, but that was whatever, almost a little over 30 years ago, I guess now. And even that was a total combat area of 100 hours. So it doesn't even compare. All of my combat experience doesn't even compare to that. Anything these guys go through probably in a single 24-hour period. I don't know what it would be like if I was under complete artillery bombardment, for example. There was a time in 2011 where one of the bases I had was shelled by rocket fire, and Katyusha rockets, I think it was. One of them landed not 100 meters from me, which almost blew my eardrums out. I mean, I was painful for a day. One rocket did. I had some other shells and mortar rounds land nearby, and IEDs and convoys and whatever, but those were momentary things. And you're talking about over a 12-month deployment, those handful of combat experiences, whatever, they're just shadows really of what these people go through. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, and I'll just kind of, as an aside here, point out, when some people think, yeah, but if the West was fighting Russia, be a different ball game. If it were against NATO's best trained troops and these guys that are doing maneuvers and stuff, I'm just telling you from somebody, because in the mid 2000s, I was the XO executive officer for an armored cav squadron. There was the divisional cavalry for the 1st Armored Division, and it was a tank and Bradley heavy fight. It was a heavy cavalry squadron, and we had not done anything besides counterinsurgency for about 5 years as a unit. And then they finally said, hey, we need to start doing some other stuff. Things are kind of settling down a little bit in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so we went back out to the training center in Germany to do force-on-force maneuver in the field. And I'm telling you, me, who always paid attention and continued to maintain my studying, I still found I was about half speed from what I had been. And guys who had never done that before, some of our newer troops, I mean, they couldn't do the most simple task that I thought. And I thought, man, if we were actually fighting a war, it would be different. But you take that the other side is now experienced in those, and I think that we would find our troops are not anywhere near as people might think they would be.
Yeah, and I've seen it in something even much simpler. Part of our CIA, when we went through paramilitary training, we went through a version of Syrskyi where you're taken prisoner and held hostage. Now, we knew that this was an exercise. We knew that this was not real. And everybody, we were all undercover. There were 25 of us, 26 of us in this group that had been taken hostage. And our instructions were to protect certain information. Now, we were kept standing in position for 36 hours. We were deprived of food. We were subjected to light and loud noise, music, and a lot of things, what's described as torture. And it was amazing the number of people that in this, what was a training environment that you knew wasn't real, they actually broke. They gave everything up. Well, wow. One woman gave me up so she could get a ham sandwich and a grape knee high.
Oh man,
I must say
for Larry.
Yeah, but I must say that about an hour after she ate that, I heard her retching in the bathroom. So I took some personal satisfaction out of that. But the point was, this was training, and even in that kind of training environment, you begin to realize people got limits, and that's without actually getting in with real bullets are being fired at you and real blasts of explosives are going off. That's what are these politicians and the people that send these kids into these, meat grinders that they don't understand.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about that in just a minute. That's a good segue, actually, also, because, okay, so I just showed you what Syrskyi has said, and you've explained how really detached from reality every single one of those are. Well, if only it were the Ukrainians who were detached from reality, you could say, all right, well, they're desperate because their country has been invaded and they're losing territory by the day. So you might forgive them for that, even if it's not wise, because it's going to harm them in the long term. But it's a little more difficult when it's our side. And people who should know better, like Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin last week in Ramstein.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's not kid ourselves. Putin will not stop at Ukraine. But as President Biden has said, Ukraine can stop Putin if we stand with Ukraine and provide the weapons that it needs to defend itself. Ukraine's survival is on the line, and all of our security is on the line. So we will continue to stand together to resist Putin's campaign of conquest, and we will continue to keep the faith with the people of Ukraine.
All right, let's take a look at a few parts of that, what he said there. Let's look at, first of all, the part that that all we have to do is give Ukraine what they need to fight. And somehow, he didn't explain how, but somehow that's going to help them win the war?
Yeah, well, unless he's figured out a way to produce actual Ukrainians. And, right now we're still left with the old Mother Nature biology process, which means, 9 months gestation, birth, and then about 18 years of growth and development. Unless Lloyd Austin's come up with a way to circumvent that process, they don't have any immediate replacement for
Really well said.
Ukrainians. So how do you make up for that? Are we ready to send more U.S. trainers into Ukraine to let them be trained? Well, then welcome to Poltava 1, Poltava 2, and Poltava 3. There'll be more of those, and you wind up with more dead Americans. They certainly don't have the stomach for that. So
what about the next part that he said, which was that this is about our survival and our security. So I want to keep giving Ukraine stuff so that they can keep fighting on the front lines about Russia, because otherwise, damn, they're coming for us. And so this is about us, and however many Ukrainians die. Well, that's sad, I guess.
Yeah, that we've always used the specter of the rampaging bear, the Russians taking over the world, and the international communist conquest. Even though the current Russian government's not communist by any stretch, they're devoutly Christian nation, number one. But Russia hasn't been the country that's been out invading others. If you go and survey the people in Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan, yeah, the Soviets were in Afghanistan back in 1979-80 and left in 1988-89. They haven't been back since. But since 1990, the only country in the world that's been rampaging, sending military forces, killing local civilians, has been the United States, with the assistance of some of our erstwhile NATO allies. They asked the people in Libya, in Syria, in Yemen, in Sudan, in Iraq,
Somalia,
in Afghanistan.
Keep going down the list.
I mean, it goes on and on. So, that's where this global South is starting to react, because they've heard this line from the United States, and they recognize not only is it they don't go to bed at night worrying about, is Russia going to attack us? They do worry about, is the United States going to attack us? And until the United States, sort of puts down its gun and decides to say, hey, we're going to see if we can get back to dealing with people through diplomacy as opposed to coercion and threats, we're going to continue to lose influence, because I think more countries in the world are just getting fed up with our line. They just don't want to live under that threat.
Now, what I just told you there, at least from Secretary Austin, was he was trying to appeal to the United States voters, which is who that was primarily focused towards, to continue to support doing this, because it's your safety that's on the list, and you have to be protected from the rampaging bear, as you put it here. But Lindsey Graham suggests there's another really good reason why we should keep supporting this.
I'm here with President Zelensky. I am such a admirer of what you and your country have done. You're trying to stop the Russians so we don't have to fight them. They don't want any American troops. They just need the weapons to free their country of a terrible invasion. They're sitting on $1 trillion worth of minerals that could be good to our economy. So I want to keep helping our friends in Ukraine. We can win this. They need our help.
Yes, we need, and we have already. The biggest help is the support of American people and support of our friends. Thanks to Lindsey and his colleagues, to congressmen and senators from the United States. Thanks for this support, bipartisan support. Thank you so much.
Peace is coming.
Yes, soon.
Peace is coming. That last part's the one that gets me the most, because the rest of it, he's basically saying, hey, however many Ukraine people need to die, as long as we get them minerals and the $1 trillion, it's all about cash. Maybe it's not about keeping us safe. It's about getting their cash.
Well, hey, before I tee off on Lindsey, let me just note that there was recently an NFL football game in Brazil, and the Philadelphia Eagles played in the game. And one of the Philadelphia Eagles players was publicly expressing fear of going to Rio de Janeiro because he was afraid he was going to be attacked, until somebody pointed out to him that the murder rate in Philadelphia is 4 times higher than that in Rio. Okay.
Oh, wow.
So here, once again, Americans projecting onto other countries what the problems are, when the problems of safety here at home. Yeah, go walk the streets of Philadelphia. Go walk the streets of Washington, D.C., New York City, Los Angeles, Oakland,
Chicago.
California. Good luck. Yeah, I could do it. I'm carrying concealed. I'd probably have some body armor on. But other than that, good luck with that. So, yeah, here we got Lindsay. He's revealed, he finally spoke about what it's all about, the money. It's all about those resources. BlackRock wasn't investing in you putting all this money and investment into Ukraine, or it's not so much investment, is getting rights signed over to them, just because the Ukrainians have a lot of beautiful women. This wasn't about stocking a beauty pageant. This was about access to oil, access to gas. When you consider the fact that Ukraine, of all countries in the world, is the 5th largest in terms of natural resources. The natural resource countries come, I think Russia's number 1, United States is number 2, China may be like number 3. Forget who number 4 is. Ukraine's number 5.
Wow.
And so then you look back and go, so if they got all that wealth in terms of natural resources, why are they the poorest nation in Europe? And the reason is the corruption.
Yep.
They've been bought out. They've sold out. It's the exact opposite and this is one of the reasons the West is mad at Vladimir Putin. Because when Putin took over, he realized that all these Russian oligarchs had gotten into bed with these Western oligarchs, and they were scooping up and raping Russia of all of its natural resources. And he called all the oligarchs in, and he read the riot act to them. He said, hey, this is going to stop. So you got to do one of two things. Either this money's going to stay in Russia, you're going to invest in Russia, it's not going to get carried off overseas. If you don't want to do that, I'm going to put you in jail. He was at least up front with the offer. And then he said, number 2, you're going to stay out of politics. Well, that's what happened. And what's happened as a result of that is a complete transformation of Russian society. I've got a friend who was working over there from 1999, still works with a law firm. And he said 99, 2000, it was described as just a complete hellhole. I actually used some stronger language. It was terrible. But now, it's like that old song, everything's up to date in Kansas City. It's modern, it's clean, it's safe, and the stores are filled with goods. The automobiles are brand new. People aren't driving clunkers. And one of the real things is the Chinese auto industry has taken over the Europeans for control of the Russian market. So that's the difference with Ukraine. In Ukraine, you've got grand disparities in wealth. Then part of it's the insider deals that we saw, like with Hunter Biden and Kofor Black getting put on the board of Burisma. Not Ukrainians. You bring out all these outside Americans so that they can profit, and the money flows out of Ukraine, not back into Ukraine.
I'm wondering, you mentioned there about BlackRock, and I know a bunch of other, I've been reading reports for months now, how a lot of other Western entities have been, helping so that they can get rights signed over to things. Well, I wonder how that's going to work if Ukraine ends up losing the war and they don't have access to it. So all the money that they spend is going to end up, I don't know, going nowhere because all the people who got it will be out of there, but Russia will be in control of it. And if we keep going on the rate that we're on right now, we're going to pave the road for that outcome to happen. And that's just egregious to even consider.
Well, and plus it's going to give Russia some more leverage on getting back the $300 billion that the West has stolen from Russia. So, they'll sit there and they'll be holding these notes for BlackRock. I think the Russians are actually pretty pragmatic negotiators. They go to BlackRock and say, okay, hey, We can give you 50 cents on your dollar, maybe 25, who knows? They're going to have some flexibility, but they can negotiate a deal with BlackRock where BlackRock doesn't go bankrupt, but Russia's going to get something in return. It's going to be a two-way street.
I want to pull a bit of a audible here. Gary, can you pull up that one from Victoria Newland that we played earlier? Do you already have it? Oh, you do? Okay, terrific. I'm really glad Gary's on top of this as always. Speaking of negotiations and what we are and aren't willing to do, you may have seen this earlier today. Here's a cut really of what Victoria Newland said. I guess it was over the weekend on a YouTuber, actually, an interview where she openly admitted that we had helped to sabotage, for the first time that I've seen her say, the negotiations in Istanbul in April of 2022. And listen to her rationale. We'll talk about it on the backside.
It became clear to us, clear to the Brits, clear to others, that Putin's main condition was buried in an annex to this document that they were working on. Mm-hmm. And it included limits on the precise kinds of weapon systems that Ukraine could have after the deal, such that Ukraine would basically be neutered as a military force. And there were no similar constraints on Russia. Russia wasn't required to pull back. Russia wasn't required to have a buffer zone from the Ukrainian border, wasn't required to have the same constraints on its military facing Ukraine. And so people inside Ukraine and people outside Ukraine started asking questions about whether this was a good deal, and it was at that point that it fell apart.
And she goes on from that point to say, well, why would we hand Russia over a victory? Because we would have to give away those things. And so we said it was a trap that Putin was trying to set for us, and we're not going to go into it. So we rejected it, and then we move forward here. And just on the first point I want to bring up there and get your view on is part of what she said is true, except that it wasn't all those things that the Russians were going to acquire of them in terms of weapons and calibers and all that kind of stuff. It wasn't hidden. It was direct. It was open. This is the deal you're being offered. And it's not as good as the one that was offered in December of 2021, which could have avoided any war. It was harsher, but still it was pragmatic, I think, to your point. How do you view that?
Well, Russia was saying, it was very clear. Hey, Ukraine, you don't get to be a shopping buddy of Raytheon, General Dynamics, Lockheed Martin. Let's go down the list of the military-industrial complex that's fueling this war. That's what bothered Victoria Nuland and the rest of the negotiators. Oh my God, our future of profits, where we're going to make money because of the stocks we hold. If Ukraine can't buy our stuff, and if we can't help fund it, how do we get paid? Russia is cutting us off from that. And we know Russia's not going to be buying our stuff. Russia's going to be making its own stuff. Oh my God, we can't have that. We need to have a customer that needs us. So let's keep this war going. It's that damn cynical. It's that corrupt. This is all about the money.
And you know what we've paid in order to keep that money flow. And it has, in that regard, if that's been the motivation of some in the West, that's been successful, because it certainly has been going on now we're closing in on 2 more years from the time that actually happened. But the cost to keep that going on, at the time that deal fell through, Ukraine still had control of Mariupol, Lysychansk, Severodonetsk, Bakhmut, Avdiivka, and scores of other smaller villages, and hundreds of thousands of Ukraine men were still alive. That's what has purchased by her, that smirky, I just want to reach in the camera and just, slap that grin off her face, because when you're talking that much blood and treasure has been lost in order to keep your side good, and you want to have the arrogance to say that, it's just really unpleasant to me.
Well, this war's been going on now for well over 2 years. But let's think back to the battle in Mariupol. That was in May of 2022. So that was like 3 months after the start of this special military operation. And the Russians successfully came in, surrounded the city, and then methodically were contracting that encirclement to the point that they finally compelled all of the Azov battalion to surrender. Now, what really caught my attention back then, and I thought it was relevant, and this was early on when the Ukrainian military still was, let's say, largely intact, at least as a military, and they still had a fairly robust supply of tanks. What we didn't see was a counterattack to rescue the encircled forces in Mariupol. Ukraine did not have the ability back then to mount the kind of counterattack that we saw that was mounted, I think, of Van Manstein when von Paulus was encircled at Stalingrad.
Yeah. I was thinking that exact thing.
Tried to break through. You know, they were stopped, but at least they tried. Hell, the Ukrainians didn't even try. So this is May of 2022. So that's when I started looking at this, going, okay, wait a second. This is not planned by the rules, if you will, because the Ukrainians made no significant attempt to try to force the Russians to have to turn around and fend off any kind of a counterattack, because the Ukrainians weren't capable of mounting one even then.
Right. Yeah, that was the point and I had made this point earlier in the war, that Ukraine had become experts at trench warfare, and they've shown that they truly have been fighting phenomenally as how much they've slowed Russia down, but they don't have any knowledge about how to conduct offensives, whether it's a counterattack to undo somebody who's trapped, or to conduct a theater attack offensive, which they abysmally failed at in 2023. And now then, even the concept of that is just totally off the table. I mean, it will take a generation to rebuild that, which is more reason why this needs to come to an end.
Well, and there you said it. They've lost a generation. They have lost, literally, in the same way that the Brits lost a generation of men in World War I. The Ukrainians have lost a generation of men in this war over the last 2.5 years, and they won't be able to recover from it. It's just it's one of those unrecoverable acts. Once they're gone, they're gone. Because look, the Brits lost what was sort of the cream, if they will, of their men in World War I, and they survived World War II. But I would argue that some of the ones that they lost in World War I had been instrumental in helping them maintain their power as a colonial
empire. Yeah.
And once they're dead, they're gone, and you start the long downhill slide, which is exactly what the Brits are going through right now.
Yeah, and the Ukraine side has just a catastrophic demographic trend that's facing right now in terms of just birth rate, just to survive as a nation. Even after the war is done, it's going to be really hard to turn that around because of the number of men that they've lost.
Yeah.
But listen, I want to shift gear here in the last few minutes we have onto a different topic, which has also been out in the U.S. news, especially today, and that is that there's competing Afghan reports. So everybody knows that in August of 2021, our 2 years of utter disastrous war in Ukraine that was long since futile, we continued on until reality finally imposed itself and the whole thing collapsed, and we left in disorganization and embarrassment and humiliation for our country. Well, now that it's whatever 2+ years later, 3+ years later, and Congress wants to do a fact-finding mission to find out the honest truth about what happened. And of course, there's two versions of the truth that come out: one Republican and then one Democrat. And of course, the Republican report talks about how everything was Biden's fault. In fact, now then, despite an earlier preliminary report that come out, now that it was actually Kamala Harris's fault. When you really look at it, apparently her name comes up like 200 and some odd times in this report. I didn't realize that was in her command authority, but anyway, that's a separate issue. But the point being that the Republicans come out and say, well, it's not timed politically that we come out with this right before the election, the day before we get to the debate between the two sides. And then, of course, the Democrats come out with their view like 10 hours later, something like that. And they say, no, actually, it was Trump's fault. Trump's the guy that set all this stuff in motion with the Doha Agreement in 2020, et cetera. and both sides accuse the other of making all these mistakes. Neither side accepts any responsibility for anything that happened, and therefore no consequences to anybody in Washington, D.C. How do you view this?
Well, I probably shouldn't be making any comment on it. I should be asking you the question because you were one of the ones who really stood up and put his career on the line and took great risk to call out the bullshit that was being spread about our efforts in Afghanistan in particular, and to challenge the chain of command. I mean, the problem we have is not one single general officer, not one single person above the rank of '06 held accountable, punished, sanctioned in any way for the litany of stupid decisions. I mean, look, granted, politicians are going to do dumb things. That's why you're supposed to have military advisors who can stand up and say, "Sir, we shouldn't do that. That's dangerous. Let's step away." And then if they refuse to follow, then like as happened with Matt Ho, you say, "Oh, then I'm out. I resign. I'm not going to be party to this." God, that takes incredible courage. And so that's something that you demonstrated. And again, I'm not arguing for a paid position here. You understand that. I'm not sucking up to Danny Davis Day.
But that good because I don't have anything to pay anyway.
Yeah,
so.
I know. But it's the people that watch you and listen to you need to understand that you're not just some handsome guy with an opinion. You're someone that was there when frankly when the nut cutting came, and you did what 90, I'd say 98% of folks in the military chain of command don't do. Stand up, put their career on the line, and speak out. So, this kind of political posturing on the eve of the election ignores the real point that, we're all the commanders. Where are the people who made the decisions or failed to make the decisions that needed to be made that got people killed?
Yeah, and one of the things that they're arguing that so many are arguing, really again on both sides of the aisle, is that we shouldn't have gotten that at all. We should have stayed. The real problem, that's why the Democrats say Trump was the problem in that he signed this deal with the Taliban. H.R. McMaster has been, going on every network under the sun saying that coming out with his new book, saying that we should never have left, that Trump made an error of having a negotiated settlement, even though it stopped the killing of Americans, even though that there was no value to our country to continue staying there. We should have left a decade ago. But according to these people, what's his face? General Petraeus, of course, is at the top of that list. To this day, openly laments about having left Afghanistan. I'm not against ending the forever wars. He actually said, we have that. We played that song a few times. It's crazy. Then the other side just says, well, yeah, but we did it wrong anyway. And, we should have handled it better. And of course, I'm partially in agreement with that. There definitely would have been ways to handle it better. But the bottom line is we should not stay there. That's completely out of line with what the American people think. And by the way, this, I think it's John Hoffman of Cato was reporting, this was either last night or earlier today. Oh, that was today. Yeah. He said a majority in Pennsylvania, pluralities in Wisconsin and Michigan say U.S. involvement in the Middle East conflicts worsens U.S. national security. And you can see the numbers there. He also said overwhelming majorities in those states say that U.S. involvement in resources cannot fix the region's problems, i.e., don't stay forever because it's never going to make any difference. That's what the American people think. So I think that the American people are tracking on what doesn't work. And when you can say, okay, you had 20 damn years to figure this out. It never changed. We're still in Iraq today. We're still in Syria today. We're still all over these places in Africa today. And none of the problems are ever solved. And then you have the H.R. McMasters, you have the Victoria Newlands, you have the Jack Keens, you have the Lindsey Grahams, always asking for more. You see, I guess yesterday, CIA Director Burns is saying, yeah, we just need to keep doing more. You saw Austin. Larry, everybody in all these so-called elite positions are saying one thing. The graphic truth on the ground is something different. Right. And you have majorities of the American people in the most important places recognizing it. What the hell's going on?
Yeah, they haven't paid attention to Sun Tzu. Sun Tzu wrote, and this is one of his key observations. He said, "There is no instance of a country having benefited from prolonged warfare." And so when you look at what the United States has been doing really for the last 60 years, 64 years at least, so let's go back to Vietnam and from Vietnam on, we've done nothing but prolonged warfare, which has increased the Department of Defense. And, we've not suffered any major casualties. Even with the 58,000 that died in Vietnam, that was over, quite a period of time. So it's not like we were racking up 2,300 a day like the Ukrainians are right now. But nonetheless, it still is an expense, and it's a drag on the country, and it ends up diverting resources so that we wind up with this odd scenario where we get to claim that we've got the most, the best military, the most modern military, at least the best funded military on the face of the planet. But our inner cities are literally shitholes filled with drug addicts that, of all ages, with homeless running rampant, with crime rising, and with, the quality of life in America deteriorating, not improving. And yet we're out, quote, making the world safer, and in the process, creating greater loss of life among others. That instead of building support where people go, God, I want to be like the Americans, they're like, hey, stay away from me.
Yeah, I need protection from that. That's the perverse part of all this, is it continues to actually undermine both our national security and our economic security. That we're eating the foundations of both of them alive, and it's egregious to me to see that large portions of the American people get it. They do see it, but because of this, there's this gap between the people and the elite that's untouchable. We can't bridge that gap, and so they're going to continue to be in charge because they're the guys who get to pull the levers of the decisions. And all we can do is stuff like this show where we're going to say, here's the truth. We're going to feed the people and show them that your instincts are right and that you're on the right track. And I don't know, maybe hopefully at some point we can actually get some good candidates up that so when you vote, it actually matters, as opposed to most of the votes that are between one bad guy or the other one. Can't do anything about that, but I don't know, Larry, all we can do is just keep telling the truth and just pray that one day God gives us a way to pierce that penetration into the elite.
We're both optimists enough that we believe you can educate people, you can inform them, and then once they're armed with correct information, good information, or at least critical thinking skills, that they can sort things out for themselves. At least, I still believe in that. And frankly, that's sort of that's the example out of Russia. That's why I think Russia is so important, because when you look at that 10-year period they went through from with the collapse of the Soviet Union up until, say, 2000, crime was rampant. The society was falling apart. People were impoverished. The average age of men started declining because they were dying in their 50s as opposed to living into the 60s. I mean, it was as bad as it could get. But out of that came a rebirth, and it was not born out of coercion. It was not born out of an authoritarian rule. It was born actually out of creating both economic opportunity, but more importantly, a rule of law that then applied to everybody, including the oligarchs. The oligarchs no longer got to buy their way out. The rule of law got applied across the board so that even the wealthy, the well-connected, were getting punished along with the poor. All of a sudden, people then started having their trust restored in government, which they have now in Russia, and we don't have it in the United States.
Yeah,
but that example gives me hope that we can turn it around here in this country as well.
Well, I really hope so. And I think one of the ways that we can get there is for our leaders to, stop being so arrogant and recognize when something isn't working. And when you just can't overcome things, that you should just acknowledge that. And listen, I'm gonna be an example of that today, because there's something that I thought I could actually match the great Larry the Shirt Johnson on our last episode, and I tried to, and the people have spoken, and they say that I failed. They
Oh,
say
really?
no.
No.
They said,
Look,
Larry Johnson is still the master of the T-shirt. So you see, I did not try and repeat my mistakes of last week.
look. I
was
saw
like,
some of the.
I defer to you, to your greatness. Larry the Shirt Johnson is the reigning champion.
Well,
Welcome to the show.
I thank you for that, but I saw some of the comments. The people loved what you did. You were rocking it, man.
Yeah, you can't count my mom though. I don't
Okay.
think that counts. But anyway, yes, I just want to end on a bit of a lightheart there. So, but I always appreciate you with your stark clarity on what's really going on the ground. Really appreciate you coming on today. Thank you.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, sir.
And we thank you guys for being a part of this show. We truly do ask you to like and subscribe this channel, and do pass it along. Do tag other people. Go on your internet, whether it's Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Telegram, whatever channels that you have. Take this show, tag it, and send it out to people. Tag it to Lindsey Graham. Tag it to H.R. McMaster. Find all these folks and say, hey, here's the real story here. Go to ABC News, CBS, Fox, CNN, whatever. All these people who are putting out this nonsense, put this out there, because if nothing else, folks, when you get some of these big channels and lots of people are talking about this just nonsense that we're exposing here, and when you tag shows like this, then a lot of other people will see the truth that might not see it before. That's one way you can have an influence. We ask you to take it. We're going to continue to be here. We'll be unintimidated and uncompromised to bring you the truth of what's happening. You can count on Daniel Davis Deep Dive to keep doing that. We will see you on the next episode.